Hello, today I'm talking about a book called Flux, which is thoroughly outside of my wheelhouse in terms of just things to talk about. Um, it's a book on molecular biology, and I would say the project of the book is a thoroughly ambitious one, which is to make the Krebs cycle interesting. And I initially read the book because that's something that I have to do, for my job. I'm a biology teacher. I hope to make the things that I teach as interesting as possible. And so, my hope was like, yeah, if the Krebs cycle can be made interesting, this guy will have done it. And I honestly think he has failed. The book sold really well, actually. So maybe I'm in the minority here. Maybe the other people who read Flux, they thought that suddenly the Krebs cycle is super duper interesting. Um, anyway, the book is written by a practicing molecular biologist. God save his soul. He runs a lab and writes these books with titles like Oxygen, a History. Um, And before I get into some of the more like kooky stuff that he talks about, because he's doing that annoying academic thing that I find actually especially repugnant in STEM fields, where he wants to popularize an idea that he has that's like kind of at the cutting edge of science, and so you know maybe not instead of, maybe instead of is too mean, but in addition to publishing peer-reviewed papers and arguing with other molecular biologists. In addition to that, he's writing books to the uninformed public, members of the uninformed public such as myself, arguing for his hypotheses. And fortunately his hypotheses are so mired in it sounds like he's claiming some really remarkable stuff, like he thinks the nature of chemistry is in the nature of consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain, but rather a result of electrical fields that are generated in the mitochondria of all eukaryotic organisms. Which is quite a claim because it means that it means that like amoebas have some form of proto consciousness. But fortunately, his argument is so mired in chemistry and like STEM knowledge that I don't think it's going to really catch on with the public. I don't think we're going to get an anthropology type situation where you finally convince the entire public of your hypothesis and then it gets overturned and it's too late. Everyone believes that now. I really don't think that's going to happen unless people start learning lots of biochemistry in high school and not forgetting it as soon as they leave. Um, which will happen never. Um, and maybe I shouldn't have so much disdain for this approach because he is, on the other hand, popularizing a very difficult subject. He's trying to popularize uh, biochemistry, which, I'm not completely sure what the value of regular schmucks knowing about biochemistry. Like, it's kind of cool, the idea that normal people would know these types of things. There's certainly not a downside to it, I guess. Uh, Anyway, so the book is on the Krebs cycle, which means I should probably give a little primer of the Krebs cycle. I recently talked to a friend who is a bioengineer, and it's what's really funny to me is I was talking to her about the Krebs cycle, and she what didn't fully remember what it was. I found a TikTok about the Krebs cycle by some medical students where they were just like clowning on the idea that this was some stuff they even had to learn at some point. So even within STEM, even within heavily like biology oriented career paths, people are still like the Krebs cycle. What the fuck is that? Um, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Okay, so here's my primer. Here's me trying to make the Krebs cycle interesting. Okay, without getting into any of the fundamental chemistry of it. Okay, so biochemists have known since before there was a biochemistry that the energy released by metabolism, that is, the energy released when you digest something, and then use that energy in your biological processes fully. Use all of the energy. Um, the energy released that way is exactly equivalent to the energy released via combustion. And so, to put that in normal person terms, what that means is that if you have a cupcake, you will release the exact same amount of energy by fully digesting it and using it to uh, power biological processes, run around and dance, whatever you like. Um, you will release the exact same amount of energy doing that you would release by burning it completely to ash. So this has been a mystery for biologists for a really long time. Like, why are these processes so close to each other? Why are they energetically equivalent? And the answer took a really long time for us to find. And it's not like it's funny because like even when biochemistry is interesting, it's not that interesting, you know? Like we discovered the answer to this question in the middle of the 20th century, at the same time that we were discovering the answers to questions like what is DNA, uh, how does DNA work, and what does it do, which is like also molecular biology, I guess, but it's just much more. I don't know, these questions about like energetics and the flow of energy through organisms are just consistently getting overshadowed by like other stuff that people care about more, which is it's very funny to me and very frustrating that like yeah, we like straight up solved this like centuries old riddle and it's like, "Oh yeah, guess what? You know, nobody cares because oh man, Francis Crick, he stole some photographs and interpreted them, and now he's got a Nobel Prize. Isn't that crazy? Um, and so this, hundreds of years old mystery was solved, and nobody cares. Anyway, the answer, once again, without getting into the too deeply into the chemistry, is basically that combustion is a process of using oxygen to turn a fuel, in our imagination, this is a cupcake, into carbon dioxide. And for reasons that have to do with physics that I don't understand, turning a complex molecule like a starch into carbon dioxide releases a whole lot of energy. And in the case of a fire, that energy is released in the form of light and heat. And our biological processes release that same quantity of energy, but in a much more controlled way, where we can take the release of energy and we can do things with it rather than just bursting into flames. Um, and the way that we do this is that rather than taking those starches in that cupcake and releasing them into carbon dioxide, turning them into carbon dioxide all at once as quickly as we possibly can, and releasing a lot of light and heat, instead we, through very careful and complex biological machinery that again we're not going to get into, we release that uh, we turn that cupcake into carbon dioxide basically one molecule at a time. And we take that energy and we carefully store it in the form of chemical potential energy using these fancy things called electron carriers. And you'll never guess what electron carriers do unless you guessed that they carry electrons. And your body has a way of turning those carried electrons into a form of chemical energy that we can then use to dance and run around and have thoughts and feelings and stuff. Okay, so that's the basis of energetics. That's the basis of cellular metabolism. The Krebs cycle itself is a network. It's a chain, a circle of um, chemical reactions in which a carbohydrate or a starch or an amino acid or anything that you want to burn to power your existence is turned into basically a small chain of carbon and hydrogen that can then be burned into carbon dioxide. Um, and the way this happens is that you have these little chains, these 4 carbon chains, that are lengthened to 6 carbon chains and then burned back down to 4. And that burning process releases energy that is stored in the form of chemical potential energy. Ta-da, that's the Krebs cycle. Okay. If you're taking like a biology class or something, you're going to have to get into a lot more detail than that. But for the purposes of just like abstractly knowing what the Krebs cycle even is, that's the Krebs cycle. It's often over-explained in a way that makes it sound really, really mysterious, but it's essentially just a chain, a cycle, also sometimes called the citric acid cycle. It's a cycle, it's a circle of reactions that enable us to take chemical compounds like sugar and release them into, burn them in slow motion, burn them very slowly in a form that releases usable chemical energy. Okay, can the Krebs cycle be made interesting? As I said, I still think the answer is no. But my boy Nick Lane, I think that's the name of the guy who wrote this book. I'm only like 70% sure. Um, my boy Nick Lane, he's gonna go for it. He's really gonna try. And one of the ways that some of the things that he talks about, first of all, he goes into the history of the Krebs cycle and the history, like the history of the discovery of the Krebs cycle. And the discovery of the Krebs cycle I find to be really, really interesting. He also talks about the Calvin cycle, also known as the Calvin-Benson cycle. The history there is a bit more interesting. So the Krebs cycle was discovered by Sir Hans Adolf Krebs. I guess we can count ourselves lucky that it's not called the Adolf cycle. Um, Hans Adolf Krebs was a German biochemist, and he was also Jewish at a very poor, very unlucky time to be Jewish in Germany. So it's actually like, I don't know, just a point of historical curiosity that the guy who eventually discovered the Krebs cycle was like not that uh, it's just very lucky that he got to spend his life doing, important biochemistry rather than, dying or having to do a bunch of stuff to like prevent himself from dying. Um, if life had shaken out just a little bit differently for Sir Hans Adolf Krebs, he would not have gotten to discover the Krebs cycle, which I think is just really interesting, and it also um, gives me an opportunity to pivot back to my wheelhouse, which is philosophizing vaguely about history. Um, and I think it's just really like poignant and interesting that the Nazis like had an opportunity, like Germany had this opportunity to take credit for this amazing discovery. Um, like they had this genius, and another figure like this is Albert Einstein. Germany was actually full of these guys, and a lot of them had to leave, and their discoveries are not typically associated with Germany. They're not like a point of German pride because the Nazis were fucking insane, and they, beyond a certain point, didn't really care how good and important your scientific discoveries were if you happened to be Jewish. Um, so yeah, Nazism bad. They almost ruined the Krebs cycle, guys. Okay, the other story that he talks about is the discovery of the Calvin, aka the Calvin Benson cycle, and this one's a little bit interesting. It's two Americans. Um, the only Usually the Calvin cycle is taught at the same time that the Krebs cycle is taught, which I think is a mistake because they're very very similar. Like they're both they're both enzymatic cycles that like you can see why students get these two confused. They're extremely similar, and they're usually taught like in the same week in biology class. Um, the Calvin cycle is part of the way that plants. It's one step of the process that plants use to turn energy from sunlight into potential chemical energy in the form of like glucose. It's sometimes described as the Krebs cycle in reverse. Um, that's glossing over some details, but it is basically it does something kind of similar to the Krebs cycle, except if you were able to run it backwards. And part of this guy's argument, the guy who wrote this book, part of this guy's argument is that the Calvin cycle and the Krebs cycle are likely derived from an earlier, like evolutionarily earlier process called the reverse Krebs cycle. And he also argues that the reverse Krebs cycle is. Oh, wait, hold on. I want to back up to talk about Calvin Benson. Okay, there's only really one fun thing to know about these guys, which is they were doing their work at a similar time to Sir Hans Adolf Krebs. Um, and they fucking hated each other. The Calvin and Benson, they really didn't like each other. Calvin won a Nobel Prize on his own, which is really fucked up because his work was like heavily interdependent with the work of Benson. And Calvin went out of his way to write Benson out of history, and I mean it worked because it's called the Calvin cycle. Nobody really calls it the Calvin Benson cycle because it's just a mouthful. Um, so yeah, Calvin did my boy Benson dirty. Okay, that's really the only interesting story about them. Um, okay, so anyway, the part of the argument of the book is that these two cycles are both derived from the reverse Krebs cycle, and the book also talks about the sort of humanocentric way that we teach biology, because the reverse Krebs cycle, if you wanted to teach the story as a like progression of like newly evolving like enzymatic pathways, you would probably start with the reverse Krebs cycle. The reverse Krebs cycle, rather than being a way to um, take chemicals and turn them into energy, is a way to take energy and use it to uh, manufacture chemicals that you can then use to like build a second cell or something. And part of the argument is that probably predates the Krebs cycle. Okay, the other part of the argument, which again the details kind of go over my head here, but he talks about the theories for the origin of life. Um, he mentions that he brings up this perspective that was kind of new to me, but now that I've been exposed to it, it makes perfect sense. Which is that he believes that the underlying cellular chemical processes uh, that exist in all cells probably are very, very ancient, and to his mind probably predate any type of genetic material, including RNA. He believes that what you start with at the origin of life is you start with these cycles, this chemistry that is self-perpetuating and that can create sort of copies of itself in this isolated form of like the cytoplasm, basically. Like he thinks, I mean, he talks about it a little bit vaguely, but he thinks that you end up with these sort of like bubbles that have chemistry going on inside of them that's different than the chemistry happening outside of them, and that these bubbles are capable of reproducing, and so you're well on your way to having life. And he believes that that process, that chemistry that's capable of perpetuating itself, probably predates genes, and that in fact our vision of genes and cellular chemistry is completely backwards, and that we should view cellular chemistry as the basis, the foundation for life, and genes as being merely a tertiary process that was created by this chemistry in order to make itself more efficient. I'm anthropomorphizing just a little bit, but you see the argument. It's that our vision of the relationship between genes and cellular chemistry is mostly correct, but it just needs to be flipped on its head. Which is it's a very interesting concept, if you ask me. And now that I've been exposed to it, it feels like it's almost certainly true. At least the part about the origin of life, that probably you get self-perpetuating chemistry well before you get um, RNA that is capable of sort of safeguarding that chemistry. Um, so that's interesting, but like a lot of this sort of speculative science, it could easily just be proven wrong. The second thing you have in this book is a more thorough explanation of something that I already sort of knew, which is that scientists believe life probably began at hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. And the reason that they believe this is, first of all, the sort of soap bubble type argument of having lipids that can form these bubbles in which like special chemistry can happen inside of them. It's chemistry that is distinct from the external environment. That type of thing, those types of like protocell bubbles, do form at certain hydrothermal vents. So that is a really that is a promising discovery. You know, that makes it's very tantalizing to say like, oh, we found the place. And then, to my mind, the more compelling evidence is that many steps in the Krebs cycle or the reverse Krebs cycle not the full cycle, but just individual steps in the Krebs cycle, occur geologically without the intervention of some sort of living creature. They just occur outside the context of biology, around these hydrothermal vents. So the idea is that you would get like a Krebs cycle type thing, like a or more likely the reverse. So a sort of proto reverse Krebs cycle. I'm sorry for the mouthful, but that's the idea. You get a proto reverse Krebs cycle that occurs in the context of these hydrothermal vents. And the way that that would happen is that many of these intermediary steps occur geologically around these hydrothermal vents. And so what you would need is you would need those bubbles coming together with a confluence of those steps that runs in a cycle. And then he's sort of unclear about the next steps from there. And then you have something that is capable of perpetuating itself in a way that sort of looks like life, where clearly this is part of the process, we're on our way. As with a lot of writing about the origin of life, um, what we know only fully makes sense if you zoom way into one part of the process and kind of don't worry about how we go from that to anything that anything that has, DNA and enzymes and controls itself and like monitors its internal processes and all that stuff. No. He's not super worried about that because, well, first of all, that's just not how science works. You can't constantly be thinking about the big picture while also pushing forward the edges of what we know in science. You have to focus on something really, really, really narrow. And in this case, I think the explanation of how you end up with the like a proto reverse Krebs cycle is very compelling to me. So that's just sort of connecting some of the stuff that I already knew about, like the hydrothermal vent stuff, a little bit of the Krebs cycle. They come together, and I had never really understood. Like I think a lot of people know it as like a fun fact that scientists believe that life originated in these hydrothermal vents, but I don't think a lot of people really know why. And the reason is that you get a lot of chemistry occurring geologically that is very foundational to biological chemistry. And so the hope is that, under very specific circumstances, maybe that geological chemistry becomes self-perpetuating and then it evolves somehow, and then we get to yada yada, et cetera, and now there's life. Um, that's the argument. I think you can hear this is not a process that we fully understand. You wouldn't be hearing about it from me if we had figured this stuff out fully. You'd be hearing about it from like CNN or something. Okay, let's see. What's the other stuff that this guy talks about? Um, he has some discussions about chemistry that go just completely over my head. Um, the only thing that's really interesting, I mean, it's very clear from the book that our understanding, but sorry, not chemistry, about cancer. He talks about cancer in a way that goes over my head. And what's really clear to me is that our understanding of cancer is pretty limited. Like, he throws out some facts that are just fucking mind bending for me. One of them is that cancerous cells often, instead of using the Krebs cycle, they rely heavily on glycolysis, which is, actually, we just don't have time for me to explain what glycolysis is, but let's just say it's a less efficient way of getting energy uh, from molecular sources. It's much less efficient, and our cells prefer to use this fancy Krebs cycle that we've evolved. Cancer cells, for some reason, don't use the Krebs cycle as often. They rely on glycolysis, and the underlying meaning of this is hotly debated. But it's fucking weird. It's weird. Like, I wouldn't. It's not something that I would have thought of, that the chemistry in a cancerous cell is fundamentally, like, radically different than the chemistry happening in a non-cancerous cell. Um, the other thing that he says that is just fucking mind-blowing is that if you take a cancerous cell and you move it from the context in which it's a part of a tumor, and you move it into, some other cell culture, it will often stop behaving like a cancerous cell. It will stop replicating out of control, which to me indicates that there's something here that we super duper don't understand. Um, Cancer is very interesting to me. as a result of the things I've been learning about biology. Cancer has become way more interesting. Like, I guess the story that we learn about cancer in high school is very neat and self-contained, and it's in a nice, neat package. But that package makes it seem like, well, any day now we're gonna cure cancer. You know, we already understand. We already basically fully understand cancer. So why haven't we solved this thing yet? And this book really gets into some of the underlying chemistry of cancer that makes it clear that no, we do not understand what's going on here. We understand what's going on here in the same way we understand what cancer does and how it kills people, but we don't understand what it is. We don't understand what is like really happening here, which is just super fascinating to me. It's like God help me. Like sometimes I read this stuff and I'm like, wow, should I learn more biochemistry? The answer is no. Don't ever let the voices win. Uh, um, okay, there's a few other things. I feel like he has some kooky ideas about consciousness being a result of electrical fields that are generated by mitochondria. And I don't fully understand what he's even saying here. Like he talks a little bit about how we don't know what anesthesia is, but we know that it is a set of drugs that cause a temporary cessation of consciousness. You don't have a conscious experience when you're under anesthesia, and so he's sort of hanging his hat on this idea that if we can discover what it is precisely that anesthesia does to cause the cessation of consciousness, we will have discovered what consciousness is. Which I think it is a decent um, working assumption for a an experimental design, but I don't think that it is ironclad in the way that he presents it. Especially since he goes immediately from that to talking about how, well, the one thing that we do know that anesthetics all have in common is that they disrupt the electrical fields generated by living things temporarily, and that electrical field can be that the disruption of that electrical field can actually be very neatly uh, uh, tied into the disruption of the experience of consciousness, and therefore consciousness almost certainly has something to do with these electrical fields. And you know, I want to be clear. I want to be clear. This is not the part of the book where he just like randomly starts talking pseudoscientifically. He makes it super duper clear in the book that these are speculative hypotheses and not something that has been proven. Um, but then again, I almost feel like if it is a speculative hypothesis, why share it with us? You know what I mean? Like me, the ignorant public. It feels a little bit irresponsible to even tell me about this type of stuff, you know? As interesting as it might be, it's just a theory. And I don't even mean that in the way that people say, like, oh, evolution is just a theory. This stuff is literally just like something that scientists are kind of toying with as an idea for what consciousness might be. And yeah, so that's his kookiest idea. Um, all right, I've run out of time. I actually have something to do right now, so this video is going to have to be over. Flux. Is the Krebs cycle, can the Krebs cycle be made interesting? No.